underline, I guess, not to isolate yourself, that if you actually do feel in a little bit of a difficult place, if some of the Elijah experience resonates with you, or that triathlon experience resonates with you, then do reach out to one another. You've clearly got something of a really great community as an association. So do just reach towards one another. And if you're not in that space, that's wonderful, but reach out to someone else who you think might be. Just be an Elisha to an Elijah in that moment. So I'm just recognizing that, really, and yeah, just wanting to, I don't know what exactly I'm trying to say, but just saying I've got your heart and I've got your back, even if I'm slightly at a distance, and I hear that if that's your experience. What I'd like to do is shift gears, as I say, a little bit, and talk a bit about fire starters, the story of fire starters, and some of the principles that we've learned, and give shape to how that is going to work out over the bulk of the second session we've got, as well as the last bit of this session right now. So let me tell you a bit about fire starters. Joth alluded to it earlier. Let me just tell you the story for a minute or two. And actually, looking around in the room, there's churches that have been involved in different ways. I've just seen Nathan and Sally Ann from Shimfield. It's fantastic to see them there. There'll be others. So some of you will be familiar with this story. Some of you are in this story, which is absolutely, absolutely brilliant. But here at Beacon Church, I've been here about 9 years, and in the first 4, 5, 6 years, something like that, we saw God really move. The church really began to grow. It really began to evolve and change. It was always a very healthy church, a wonderful church, without doubt, fantastic church in all ways. But it began to, its growth in numbers began to accelerate slightly, certainly within the context of UK churches and Baptist churches. And that was thrilling to see God do that. And part of that journey was to connect with some other churches who were experiencing some similar accelerated growth. We just wanted to share stories, learn lessons, stand together in the midst of that. And first of all, this is way back in 2015, 16. We had a little gathering. I think there was only 4 or 5 of us just gathered, and we spent a couple of days together, and we prayed for each other, and we heard one another's story. And out of that was about July time of the year. And out of that, we thought, why don't we just do this once again? We'll do it in November, but we'll invite some of our emerging leaders along, and we got 1 or 2 other growing churches involved. And we gave it the very jazzy title, the Growing Churches Forum. Not much imagination going on there, really. But actually about 40 of us in total, 7 or 8 churches that were growing in our Baptist family, but about 40 individuals. We gathered, and we had a tremendous couple of days together, one of the most heartwarming couple of days that I've ever had the privilege of being part of. And we just told stories of what God was doing, and shared the lessons we were learning, and stood together in conversation. And out of the back of that, there was a kind of just half-hour coffee meeting that some of us had. And out of that, very organically, in a very unplanned way, what emerged was this sense of, well, why don't we just create spaces where conversations can happen, where we can invite churches in just to hear the stories of what God is doing in these Baptist churches that are growing more quickly. Just share the stories and share the lessons, and see what God might do. And wonderfully, our Baptist Together family, I'm a huge, absolute fan of our Baptist Together family. Lynn Green, I just think she is a marvelous leader over us. I absolutely honor her. I think she's doing a fabulous job, has done for the best part of a decade now, and has led us really well over this season too. But the Baptist Together family just said, we want to be behind this, and put just a little bit of funding into it, so that churches could access those conversations without finances being a barrier. And we started to host those conversations, and we had a dream. We kept the numbers low, no more than 25 people, and 2 or 3 churches that were growing would come along and share their stories, and it would be a conversation, not a conference, not keynote speakers with all the answers, just a conversation of finding what God was doing, and encouraging each other, and gently challenging each other to pursue him more. And we had a dream that over a 3-year period, of which this year would have been the last year, over a 3-year period, God might work that 100 Baptist Together churches might see twice as many baptisms in the 12 months following one of those fire starter conversations as the 5 years before. That's what we prayerfully dreamed God might do. 100 Baptist Together churches would see twice as many baptisms in the year following attending one of these conversations as they did in the 5 years beforehand. And we're well into the 70s now, maybe 73 churches have seen God work in that way Obviously, a fire starter conversation is one small ingredient of a whole mass of more of what God might be doing. But just hosting these conversations of Baptist churches talking about learning the lessons, sharing the stories of God at work in bringing numerical growth, conversion growth. So it's just brilliant. It was just brilliant. And out of that, we started to notice a pattern, if you like, that in churches that were growing, Baptist churches that were numerically growing, though they were incredibly diverse, they tend to be much smaller, but some of them are big. Some are city, some are rural, some are urban, some are well off, some are poorly financed, some are home mission, some are rolling in cash. Huge diversity in many ways. But there were some common principles of how they lived under God, and God was at work in them. And we kind of just gathered those principles together. So what we're going to do through to about 10 past 11. So what we're going to do for the last half an hour before there's other stuff that goes on for you guys is you're going to see a video. It is actually me talking, but I just thought it was a more concise way of talking through these 7 principles that we've uncovered as we've journeyed together as growing churches. So each principle takes just a minute or two. So the whole video is only 13 minutes and it covers those 7 principles. So what I want you to do is take note of each of the 7, just on a scrap of paper, wherever, just write down the title of each 7. And then post the video. We're going to go straight back into a breakout group just for a few minutes. And I want you to talk about which of those are key to you, which ones really resonate with you, and which one is just a waste of space, which one do you fundamentally disagree in. And I deliberately want to be slightly binary to provoke some helpful conversation. So in those small breakout groups, in those small breakout groups, which one really resonates with you? Which of those 7 principles you're saying, yes, we need to do that, we're behind that, I get that. And which one do you say, actually, I think that's a bit of a waste of space. I don't think that has a relevance. I don't think that's for me. So that's the conversation in your breakout groups. And then you'll be brought back into this larger group at about 11 o'clock, maybe 5 past 11. And we're going to do a poll and you'll get to vote for 3 of the 7. And what we want to do is we want to identify the 3 that are most relevant to you as a community. And then when we come back for the second session, Chris Knight and I are going to take those 3 and just try and share some lessons that we've learned around those 3. So I hope that makes sense. So as I say, there's going to be a video that just presents the 7 principles. As we're going through them, write down the 7 in your own words into a breakout group, identify the one most useful and the one that's a waste of space, talk them through, and then back just for a few minutes, 5 minutes, to identify the 3 most relevant, to cast your vote, and we'll grab 3. And in the second session, we'll dig into those 3 in a bit more detail and see what God is saying to us. So hope that makes sense. It's a bit hard on Zoom to see whether people are nodding their faces or going, I have no idea, but I hope that makes sense. So Chris or Joff, if we could go to that video now and then straight into the breakout groups afterwards, that would be great. So we're thinking about 7 marks which seem to be true of some of our fastest growing churches in our Baptist family. Mark number 1 is that prayer is where the battle is won. That all the churches we know which are growing rapidly, at the heart of that growth is leader-led, demanding prayer. The belief that the God who is our Father is also our King. He's our Father, so he listens to us with kindness, but he's our King, so he acts upon what we ask. And all the churches that we've come across, which are growing rapidly under God's grace, have a leader or a leadership team at their heart who is radically committed in their prayer life. It's places like Ephesians 6, where we read of the armour of God. And once we're clad in that armour, ready to fight, where is the battleground at the end of Ephesians 6? It's a call to prayer. That's where the battle is won. Or in 1 Timothy chapter 1, where we're told to lift up holy hands in prayer. That little phrase, lift up, is a fighting metaphor. Literally, lift up your hands and get ready to go into battle. All these churches which are growing rapidly have at their heart not necessarily a praying church, but a praying leader, radical about their prayer life.
Maybe they're getting up at 5 o'clock every morning. Maybe 2 whole days of every week of their paid time is given to prayer walking the town. Maybe they're putting plectrums in plant pots or other creative ways to call on God to work in their church. Number one of these markers is a belief that prayer is where the battle is won, and a leader who is deadly serious about that. The second marker we've found is that good preaching is central, because these churches believe that God's Spirit does God's work through God's Word. And so they are serious about understanding it and explaining it and applying it in real life. In a sense, they are old school evangelical, a really strong belief in God's Word, and that God's Word is where God's work is done. It's pillar and buttress preaching, as we're told in Timothy. The pillar holds that word high, makes it beautiful for everybody to see. The buttress holds it firm, so it's not blown or moved by the winds of culture. The churches that are growing are serious, both about buttress and pillar, holding that word firm and lifting that word high. But it's worth also reflecting that though I say good preaching is central, the means of communication can be quite creative. Some do preach a monologue over 20 or 30 minutes. Others are serious about Bible study or one-to-one work with the Bible or creative ways of communicating God's work. It's not so much the means or the mechanism of communication, that varies. It's the content. These churches stand on God's word, fully persuaded that it does God's work. This is mark number 3. Churches which are growing in our Baptist family know what they're about, and everybody is about it. They know what they are about, and everybody is about it. It's about a clarity of vision and an ability to draw everyone into playing their part in achieving that vision. Empowerment, if you like. What it means is these churches are able to clearly but graciously say no to good things when they come about. Good things which a church could very legitimately be involved in, but they know isn't what God has called them to be part of. They're also able to communicate to people in the church how their gifting or their volunteering hours or their skills that they're giving are contributing to the bigger picture. That they're not just doing something in a silo on their own, but their contribution is helping to achieve something much more. So these churches which are growing know what they're about. They have a clarity of a vision given to them by God, and everybody is about it. They're great at empowering people to play their part. So we're on to our fourth mark, describing churches which are growing rapidly. I want to underline again that this is not some guaranteed equation that if you do these things your church will grow. It's simply descriptive. It's what we've found as we've journeyed and talked with churches which are growing rapidly. They're for you to weigh and consider and learn from. The fourth is that these churches which are growing are confident that the leaders they have, the people they have, are enough. They're not paralyzed by that question, well, we need to wait until God brings us the right person or the right skill set, or even perhaps the right amount of money. No, they realize that God is too wise to make a mistake and too loving to wish us harm. And if he has genuinely called them to step out and do something, then he's already given them, or he will give them, the people, the leaders, the resources, or the money that they need to achieve that. They are not paralyzed by the question of who or what or how. They move forward wisely but courageously, trusting God. They believe that the leaders they have are enough. Now this next marker, number 5, is really important, I've found. And actually, as I've spoken to churches which through Firestarters have begun to grow, many of those have pointed to this marker as the key one. It's that they've put evangelists in key direction setting and culture setting positions. That the evangelist's voice is heard at a leadership level. Now, I have to admit that many of these fast-growing churches, actually, their minister or a paid person is also an evangelist. But I don't think it's limited to that having to be the case. There's lots of creative ways to bring that evangelist voice into a direction setting or leadership context. For example, you could appoint someone to be a volunteer leader, a deacon or an elder who is an evangelist. Or if they don't yet have the character to be a leader in the church, you could ask them to come and consult, to join meetings and voice their opinion around various decisions that are taking place. If you feel you haven't got an evangelist in your church, then why not invite someone who's not part of your church to join one or two of your meetings? Perhaps you could speak to your regional minister and ask who they might recommend from another church who could join you at strategic times and be that evangelist voice helping to shape and round your decision making. Or you could play the game of what would the evangelist say. As you meet as a leadership team and discuss a particular situation or opportunity, pause in the meeting and say, if an evangelist was here, what would they say about this? The marker, the point I'm trying to make, is it's so important in our church life that an evangelist's voice is heard in the direction setting or culture setting spaces. For whatever reason, that is missing from so many of our churches. The pastor, the teacher, they're all heard, but the evangelist isn't. So this marker is about finding the way to invite the evangelist's voice into the direction setting of your church. So here we are in the penultimate marker of growing churches in our Baptist family, marker number 6. And it's this. These churches have looked hard at the question, what's the worst that could happen, and realised it's not actually that bad. So many of our churches, when it comes to an opportunity or something that God has said or a way that they could go as a church, a group they could reach, they ask the question, what's the worst that could happen, and are paralysed by it. Panic, say we couldn't risk that, it's too dangerous. But these churches that are growing fast have asked that question and realised the answer isn't actually that bad. What is the worst that could happen? You might try something for a few months and it not be fruitful. You might try something for a few months and some people in your church don't find it to their preference and you revert back to an old way of doing things. The worst that could happen is not really that bad. And on the flip side, they've asked the question, well, what's the best that could happen? If we tried this, if we took the risk, if we did something that was a little bit out the box or not our normal way of doing things, what's the best that God could do with that? And realize that best could be something quite amazing. Another way to put this marker, that they've asked the question, what's the worst that could happen, and realized it's not that bad, is to say that these churches that are growing realize that to reach people who are not being reached, they're going to need to do some things that aren't being done. And they're ready to give those things a go. This last one is that churches that are growing reinvent the trellis to both cater for and catalyse growth. That they're churches which know that as they get larger, or so they can get larger in reaching people, they need to rethink how they're organised, how they're structured, how leadership works, how decision making and discernment works. Now, these aren't always the easiest questions for churches to grapple with, but they are worth grappling with. If the trellis isn't big enough, if it's not strong enough, then the vine cannot be fruitful. And ultimately, actually, the whole trellis and vine can collapse on itself. Obviously, if the trellis itself is too big and too unwielding, it kills off the vine. It's fruitful vines we want. Trellis ultimately is just dead wood, but the trellis is needed, of an appropriate size. And what these churches that are growing have done and realize they need to do is they need to reinvent, recreate that trellis more often than we would imagine, to be the next size up so the vine can fill that space. And if they don't do that, they plateau, they stop growing. New people can't be reached, or if new people are reached, that's great, but other people are leaving for negative reasons. So this last marker is about organisation. It's about structure. We see it in places like Acts 6. They reinvent the trellis to both cater for and catalyse growth. So let me run through those 7 markers of growing churches. First, prayer is where the battle is won. Second, that good preaching is central. Third, they know what they're about and everyone is about it. Fourth, they know the leaders and the people they have are enough for what God's called them to do. 5, they put evangelists in key direction and culture setting positions. 6, they look hard at the question, what's the worst that could happen, and realise it isn't that bad. And 7, they reinvent the trellis to both cater for and catalyse growth. I really hope those descriptions of growing churches might help you think about what God is calling you to do as a church or as a leader.